flying upside down. West often said that they were playing a game called getting a machine out the door of Data General with their names on it. What were the rules? "There's a thing you learn at Data General if you work here for any period of time," said West's lieutenant of hardware, Ed Rezala. "That nothing ever happens unless you push it. To at least some people upstairs, this condition took the name competition for resources. As a strategy of management, it has a long lineage. Throw down a challenge," writes Dale Carnegie in that venerable Bible of stratagems dressed up as homilies, How to Win Friends and Influence People. In a sense, the competition between Eagle and North Carolina was institutionalized. Each project lay in the domain of a different vice president, but that may have been accidental. West's boss, who was the vice president of engineering, Carl Carmen, remarked that he had worked at IBM, and that compared to competition among divisions there. Rivalry among engineering teams at Data General resembled Sunday school. Moreover, Carmen said, in a company with a mature product line like Data General's, situations naturally occur in which not enough large new computers are needed for every team of computer builders to put one of its own out the door. And yeah, Carmen continued, the competition is fostered. He said that DeCastro liked to see a little competition stirred up among teams. Let them compete with their ideas for new products, and bad ideas, as well as the negative points of good ones, are likely to get identified inside the company and not out in the marketplace. That was the general strategy, Carmen said. What it now meant downstairs to the Eclipse group was that they not only had to invent their new computer, but also had to struggle for the resources to build it. Resources meant, among other things, the active cooperation of such so-called support groups as software. You had to persuade such groups that your idea had merit and would get out the door, or else you wouldn't get much help. And then your machine almost certainly wouldn't get out the door. Here's how it looked to West. The company could not afford to field 2 new big computers. Data General had made a large investment in North Carolina as a place where major computers would be built. And although the Eclipse Group's engineers had good technical reputations, North Carolina's had better ones. The game was fixed for North Carolina, and all the support groups knew it. So West started out by calling Eagle insurance. It would be there in case something went wrong down south. Thus he avoided an open fight, and thus he could argue that the support groups should hedge their bets and put at least a little effort into this project, too. As for North Carolina's superior reputation, West never stopped suggesting to people around Westboro that their talents had been slighted. His message was, "Let's show 'em what we can do." "West takes lemons and makes lemonade," observed Alsing. From the first rule, that you must compete for resources, it followed that if your group was vying with another for the right to get a new machine out the door, then you had to promise to finish yours sooner, or at least just as soon as the other team promised. West had said that the Eclipse group would do Ego in a year. North Carolina had said, okay, they'd finish their machine in a year. In turn, West had said that Eagle would come to life in a year. West said he felt he had to pursue what's the earliest date by which you can't prove you won't be finished, scheduling in this case. We have to do it in a year to have any chance. But you felt obliged to set such a schedule anyway, in order to demonstrate to the ultimate boss's strong determination. Promising to achieve a nearly impossible schedule was a way of signing up, the subject of the third rule, as I saw it. Signing up required, of course, that you fervently desired the right to build your machine and that you do whatever was necessary for success, including putting in lots of overtime, for no extra pay. The fourth rule seemed to say that if the team succeeded, those who had signed up would get a reward. No one in the group felt certain that stock options were promised in case of success. "But it sure as hell was suggested," said one of the Microkids. All members of the team insisted that with or without the lure of gold, they would have worked hard. But for a while, at least, the implied promise did boost spirits, which were generally high anyway. I think that those were the rules that they were playing by. And when I recited them to some of the team's managers, they seemed to think so, too. But Alsing said there was probably another rule that stated, "One never explicitly plays by these rules." And West remarked that there was no telling which rules might be real, because only DeCastro made the rules that counted, and DeCastro was once quoted as saying, "Well, I guess the only good strategy is one that no one else understands." They lived in a land of mists and mirrors. Mushroom management seemed to be practiced at all levels in their team. Or perhaps it was a version of Steve Wallach's ring protection system made flesh. West feeling uncertain about the team's real status upstairs. West's own managers were never completely aware of all that their boss was up to, and the brand new engineers kept almost completely ignorant of the real stakes, the politics, the intentions that lay behind what they were doing. But they proceeded headlong. Wallach's architectural specification was coming along nicely now. The attempt to turn those ideas into silicon and wire and microcode had begun. Now they had to create a complete design and do it in a hurry. Carmen made it policy that members of the team could come and go more or less as they pleased. These were confident, aggressive young engineers, racehorses, West liked to say, and they were about to be put under extreme pressure. Carmen hoped that by allowing them to stomp out of the basement at any time without fear of reprisal, he would be providing an adequate escape valve. At last, by the fall of 1978, the preliminaries were complete. The kids had been hired, the general sign-up had been performed, the promises suggested, and the escape valve established. Then West turned up the steam. You're a microkid like John Blau. You arrived that summer, and now you've learned how to handle Trixie. Your immediate boss, Chuck Holland, has given you a good overall picture of the microcode to be written, and he's broken down the total job into several smaller ones and has offered you your choice. You've decided that you want to write the code for many of the arithmetic operations in Eagle's instruction set. You always liked math and feel that this will help you understand it in new, insightful ways. You've started working on your piece of the puzzle. You can see that it's a big job, but you know you can do it. Right now you're doing a lot of reading to prepare yourself. Then one day you're sitting at your desk studying Booth's algorithm, a really nifty procedure for doing multiplication, when Alzing comes by and tells you, "There's a meeting." You troop into a conference room with most of the other new hires, joking, feeling a little nervous, and there waiting for you are the brass. The vice president of engineering, another lower-level but important executive, and West, sitting in a corner chewing on a toothpick. The speeches are brief. Listening intently, you hear all about the history of 32-bit superminis. These have been around a while, but sales are really picking up. DEC's starting to turn out VAXs like jelly beans, and the word is DEC'll probably introduce a new model of VAX in about 9 months. No one's saying it's your fault, but Eagle's late, very late. It really must be designed and brought to life and be ready to go by April. Really. In just 6 months, that won't be easy, but the brass think you can do it. That's why you were hired. You're the cream of a very fine crop. Everything depends on you now, they say. You feel good about yourself and what you're doing when you leave that meeting. You go right back to your desk, of course, and pick up Booth's algorithm. In a little while, though, you feel you need a break. You look around for another microkid to share coffee with you. But everyone is working assiduously, peering into manuals and cathode ray tubes. You go back to your reading. Then suddenly you feel it, like a little trickle of sweat down your back. "I've gotta hurry," you say to yourself. "I've gotta get this reading done and write my code. This is just one little detail. There's 100 of these. I better get this little piece of code done today." Practically the next time you look up, it's midnight, but you've done what you set out to do. You leave the basement thinking, this is life, accomplishment, challenges. I'm in control of a crucial part of this big machine. You look back from your car at the blank, brick, monolithic back of Building 14A/B and say to yourself, what a great place to work. Tomorrow you'll have to get to work on an instruction called FFAS. That shouldn't be too hard. When you wake up the next morning, however, FFAS is upon you. Oh my God, FFAS, they need that code next week. I better hurry. The pressure, said Blau. I felt it from inside of me. In another cubicle around this time, Dave Epstein of the Hardy Boys is dreaming up the circuits of a thing called the microsequencer. Nothing else will work without this piece of hardware. Some weeks ago, Ed Rezala asked Epstein, how long will it take you? Epstein replied, about 2 months. 2 months, Rezala said. Oh, come on. So Epstein told him, okay, 6 weeks. Epstein felt as if he were writing his own death warrant. 6 weeks didn't look like enough time, so he's been staying here half the night working on the thing, and it's gone faster than he thought it would. This has made him so happy that just a moment ago he went down the hall and told Rezala, hey, Ed, I think I'm gonna do it in 4 weeks. Oh, good, Rezala said. Now back in his cubicle, Epstein has just realized, I just signed up to do it in 4 weeks. Better hurry, Dave. I don't know if I'm complaining, though, says Epstein. I don't think I am. I work well under pressure. Indeed, Epstein will finish on schedule and his design will turn out to be almost errorless. But not everyone works well under such conditions. Not everyone thinks it is worth it. A couple of engineers have already dropped out. A few are less than happy. One hardy boy, Josh Rosen, looks around and can hardly believe what he sees. For example, Microkids and hardy boys are arguing. A Microkid wants the hardware to perform a certain function. A hardy boy tells him, "No way, I already did my design for microcode to do that." They make a deal. "I'll encode this for you if you'll do this other function in hardware." All right. What a way to design a computer. There's no grand design, thinks Rosen. People are just reaching out in the dark, touching hands. Rosen is having some problems with his own piece of the design. He knows he can solve them if he's just given the time. But the managers keep saying, "There's no time." Okay, sure, it's a rush job, but this is ridiculous. No one seems to be in control, nothing's ever explained. Foul up, however, and the managers come at you from all sides. "The whole management structure," said Rosen. "Anyone in Harvard Business School would have barfed." In relatively serene times, some years before Eagle, West and his wife had made friends with an electrician who lived in their town. The man's name was Bernie. He owned a small airplane. Since West's farmhouse and barns lay under one line of approach to the little local airport, Bernie often flew over. When he did, he would waggle his wings. He might do a quick roll. Sometimes he'd climb halfway out of his window and wave down at the Wests. "Bernie likes to fly upside down," West remarked, and he and his wife shook their heads and laughed. Alsing often heard West talk about flying upside down. It seemed to mean taking large risks, and the ways in which West used the phrase left Alsing in no doubt that flying upside down was supposed to be a desirable activity, the very stuff of a vigorous life. Ed Zoller allowed that West made life in their corner of the basement more dramatic, definitely more dramatic, than it usually had to be. But neither Zoller nor Alsing nor Wallach balked when West said that they had to fly upside down now. Over this project loomed the memory of ego. No one wants to see hard work come to nothing, and ego was generally accounted a disaster. But it had lasted just a few months and had involved only a few engineers. About 30 were working on Eagle now. That the project might be tossed on the scrap heap somewhere along the way after months of 30 souls' passionate labor was unthinkable. But it could certainly happen, they thought. West had felt that he had to promise to do Eagle in something like a year in order to get the chance to do it. Now he chose to believe that to get it out the door, they really had to come close to meeting that absurd schedule. At the same time, they had to do it right in the commercial sense. The whole project was risky from the start. In service of the big risk, West undertook on the team's behalf many smaller ones. "We're always assuming that things'll break right for us," observed Alsing. West was assuming, for instance, that the software resources would be there when they were needed. They were all assuming that youngsters fresh from college could build a major new computer, though none of the recruits had built anything like this before. Looking for a technical advantage, West gambled that the coming thing in chips was a type of circuit known as a PAL. The manufacture of integrated circuits is a fairly risky business. It is said that factories can suddenly become inoperative for no apparent reason, though a small infusion of dust is a common suspect. So the conventional wisdom holds that in making a new computer, you never plan on using any sort of brand new chip unless at least 2 companies are making it. At that moment, only one fairly small company was making. But if Palace really were the coming thing, it would be a win to use them. West decided to do so. West figured that the Eclipse Group had to show quick and constant progress in order to get the various arms of the company increasingly interested in helping out. For public relations, and maybe in order to keep the pressure on his crew, he made extravagant claims. He always pushed them one step ahead of themselves. Before Wallach finished specifying the architecture, West had the team designing the boards that would implement the architecture. Before the engineers cleaned up their designs, West was ordering wire-wrapped prototype boards. Before the wire wraps could possibly be made right, he was arranging for the making of printed circuit boards. And long before anyone could know whether Eagle would become a functioning computer, West had the designers stand in front of a TV camera and describe their parts of the machine. The result of this last act of hubris was a videotaped extravaganza some 20 hours long. West planned to use it, when the right time came, if it ever did, as a tool for spreading the news of Eagle all around Westboro. "Pretty gutsy," he said with a grin, nodding toward the shelf full of videocassettes. One evening West paused to say to me, "I'm flat out by definition, I'm a mess, it's terrible." A pause. "It's a lot of fun." West established the rules for the design of Eagle, and he made them stick. The team should use as little silicon as possible, a mere few $1,000s worth of chips. The CPU should fit on far fewer than VAX's 27 boards, and each major element of the CPU should fit on a single board. If they could fulfill those requirements, Eagle would be cheaper to build than VAX. On the other hand, it had better run faster than VAX by certain widely accepted standards. It should be capable of handling a host of terminals. A CPU is not a functioning computer system. Eagle also had to be compatible with existing lines of data general peripherals as well as with Eclipse software. On the magic marker board in his office, West wrote the following: "Not everything worth doing is worth doing well." Asked for a translation, he smiled and said, "If you can do a quick and dirty job and it works, do it." Worry, in other words, about how Eagle will look to a prospective buyer. Make it an inexpensive but powerful machine, and don't worry what it'll look like to the technology bigots when they peek inside. West espoused these principles of computer design. There's a whole lot of things you've got to do to make a successful product. The technological challenge is one thing, but you can win there and still have a disaster. You gotta give them guidelines so that if they follow them, they're gonna be a success. Do A, B, C, and D without getting the color of the front bezel mixed up in it. Another precept was no bells and whistles. And a third, you tell a guy to do this and fit it all on one board, and I don't want to hear from him until he knows how to do it. West reviewed all of the designs. Sometimes he slashed out features that the designers felt were useful and nice. He seemed consistently to underestimate the subtlety of what they were trying to do. All that a junior designer was likely to hear from him was "it's right," "it's wrong," or "no, there isn't time." To some, the design reviews seemed harsh and arbitrary and often technically short-sighted. Later on, though, one hardy boy would concede that the managers had probably known something he hadn't yet learned: that there's no such thing as a perfect design. Most experienced computer engineers I talked to agreed that absorbing this simple lesson constitutes the first step in learning how to get machines out the door. Often, they said, it is the most talented engineers who have the hardest time learning when to stop striving for perfection. West was the voice from the cave, supplying that information. "Okay, it's right. Ship it." West kept final authority over the circuit designs, but he loosened control over most of the management of their creation. How did the Hardy boys invent the general plan for the hardware? "Essentially," said Ed Rezala, "some of the guys and I sat down and decided what elements we needed." Over in the micro team, though never explicitly told to do so, Chuck Holland took on the job of organizing the microding job. Holland and Ken Halberger mediated the deals between Hardy boys and Microkids, but in general, the veterans let them work things out for themselves. The entire Eclipse group, especially its managers, seemed to be operating on instinct. Only the simplest visible arrangements existed among them. They kept no charts and graphs or organizational tables that meant anything. But those webs of voluntary, mutual responsibility, the product of many signings up, held them together. Of course, to a recruit it might look chaotic. Of course, someone who believed that a computer ought to be designed with long thought and a great deal of preliminary testing, and who favored rigid control, might have felt ill at the spectacle. Criticism of that sort flattered West. "Show me what I'm doing wrong," he'd say with a little smile. In fact, the team designed the computer in something like 6 months and may have set a record for speed. The task was quite complex. The machine took its first material form in paper, in a fat volume of pages filled up with line after line of zeros and ones, and in bound books large as atlases that contained the intricate geometrical depictions of the circuits, neatly drawn by their draftsmen. You could think of this small library of microcode and schematics as the engineers collected but not wholly refined thoughts on a variety of subjects. The language was esoteric, but many of the subjects were as familiar as multiplication. I had imagined that computer engineering resembled the household electrician's work, but it seemed the bulk of it lay in making long skeins of logical connections, and it had little to do, at least at this stage, with electricity. I wondered, too, why they had to struggle to fit Eagle's CPU onto 7 boards. 7 was the goal, when elsewhere engineers were routinely packing entire CPUs onto single chips. The general answer was that a multi-board CPU performs simultaneously many operations that a single-chip CPU can do only sequentially. By making a CPU on several boards, you can make it run much faster than a CPU on a chip. A time was probably coming when components would operate so quickly that the distance that signals had to travel would intimately affect the speed of most commercial computers. Then miniaturization and speed would become more nearly synonymous. But that day had not yet arrived. Designing Eagle, they went far beyond what could yet be done on a single chip. Many of the chips that they used came to them ready-made to perform certain kinds of operations. This took most of the pure physics from their endeavor. West's decision to use the new chips called Palace gave the designers certain advantages. Certainly it helped some of them work swiftly. When Ken Holberger, for instance, came to a tricky part of a design, one that promised to take a long time to create, he could often just draw a box on his diagram and leave that box blank. A single programmable PAL could be made to perform all the functions that the box had to do. "PAL here," he would write on his diagram in effect. Later, he could come back and program the PAL. In the meantime, prototypes of the new machine could be built. But eventually, the designers had to program every PAL. They had to invent the complex internal organization of each of those chips. They had to know what all the chips were meant to do. And there were thousands of chips in an Eagle. Some engineers likened the chips to an unassembled collection of children's building blocks. Some referred to the entire realm of chip design and manufacture as technology, as if to say that putting the chips together to make a computer was something else. A farmer might feel this way. Technology is the new hybrid seeds that come to the farm on the railroad, but growing those seeds is a different activity. It's just raising food. Eagle's designers adopted ideas that were abroad in the industry. From their files, they took some of the material that had been concocted in the days of Ego and Victor. Much of the inspiration for the details came from Ego. But they invented the largest part of Eagle themselves in 5 or 6 months, between the late summer of 1978 and the new year. From one angle, the task was to make an engine that would obey, without fail and at great speed. Each of the roughly 400 chores named in Eagle's instruction set. One night after work, Microkid John Blau described for me the progress of just one of these basic chores, or assembly language instructions, through the engine. He left out some steps, simplified many others, and kept the description fairly abstract. Even so, the short tour consumed several hours. Blau was living in an apartment complex near Natick, Massachusetts. His rooms were neat but sparsely furnished, with an old couch, a beanbag-type chair, and a bookcase eclectically stocked. His intellectual diet seemed to consist of science fiction, well-reviewed novels, philosophy, physics, and math. A 10-speed bike leaned against a wall in the bedroom. His bed was a mattress on the floor. He apologized for the emptiness of the refrigerator. It was the apartment of a young man going elsewhere, and it made me feel old. With Blau, I descended, as it were, into Eagle's engine room. He pointed out the main parts of Eagle and spoke of them as if they were sensate things that asked questions, looked up answers, sent, and received messages. It's a way of talking about computers that makes some people nervous, but it was one of the ways he thought about the machine when he was working on it. In order to execute an instruction in a user program, the engine has to do a lot of other work first, Blau explained. We should assume that a special program, a program of programs, let's call it, is already running. This program communicates with people using the computer, and it does jobs for them. It schedules and monitors all the user programs that are currently running. It will also find a program for a user. This program of programs contains input and output assembly language instructions, which tell the input/output control board, the IOC, how to move information back and forth between the engine and the user's terminals. The IOC makes it possible for the computer to communicate with the outside world. Roughly speaking, it plays the role of a translator who knows many different tongues. It can arrange for the movement of information at high speed and also for communication with user devices that work at relatively slow speeds. It's complicated. Okay, said Blau, someone out there at a terminal, a user wants to run a program, call it program FOOBAR. Through a terminal, this user tells the program of programs, run program FOOBAR. The program of programs tells the IOC to move part of that program from a storage disk outside of the CPU into the CPU's main memory, and to do so at high speed. This accomplished, the program of programs turns over control to program FOOBAR. The machine then starts executing the instructions of program FOOBAR, one after the other. Before the engine can execute an instruction, it has to find it, of course. Then it has to fetch it and decode it. Thus we came to the printed circuit board known as the instruction processor. The IP, it was called, and it was quite a tricky thing. The IP has a relatively small memory of its own. In a sense, the IP makes assumptions about what the next instructions in the user program will be, and it keeps those instructions handy in its storage. Acting on its assumptions, it finds, fetches, and decodes instructions ahead of time. It gets them in the pipeline. For this reason, the IP is also known as an accelerator. It does work that any computer must do, but it does it in advance. Suppose, however, said Blau, that program FOOBAR has been running for a while and the IP discovers, as it does now and then, that it doesn't have the next instruction in its own memory. At this point, the IP sends a message to the Address Translation Unit, the ATU, which, among other roles, keeps a map of the CPU's main memory. In its message, the IP asks the ATU for the location of the next block of instructions in user program FOOBAR. Let's assume, said Blau, that the ATU finds that next block in its map. This means that the needed instructions are residing in main memory. The ATU knows where and passes the news to the IP. The IP, in turn, sends a message to another accelerator, known as the System Cache, SYS cache, for short, asking for those next instructions. Maybe the SYS cache has that next block of instructions. If so, it doesn't have to send away for them, but can pass them right on to the IP, and time is saved. If, however, the SYS cache doesn't find those instructions in its own memory, it retrieves them from main memory and passes them on to the IP. But, said Blau, this next block of instructions may not be in main memory either. Other people are using the computer, running other programs. Main memory is large, but not large enough to hold all the parts of all those programs at the same time. Usually it's holding only some parts of each program. So we should assume, said Blau, that the next section of program FOOBAR is sitting outside the CPU, still in peripheral storage on a disk. In this case, the ATU doesn't find the address of the next block of instructions in its map. So the ATU sends a message to the microsequencer. The sequencer holds the microcode, and it was worth noting, Blau said, that many of the actions so far undertaken have been performed at the direction of microcode. The microsequencer responds to the ATU's message by sending out a certain microprogram, which turns over control of the search to system software. System software, in turn, orders up something called a page fault program, which contains many assembly language instructions, and hence many microprograms. This page fault program should tell the machine how to find that next block of instructions in program FOOBAR and how to bring it into the memory system. It really should not happen. It would constitute a software design error if it did, Blau said. But just imagine that the instructions for the page fault program aren't in the memory system, but are instead out on a disk somewhere. In order to get the instructions for the page fault program off the disk, Eagle would have to perform a page fault program, but it couldn't perform a page fault program to get the instructions until it already had them. It would be as if you had locked up a cabinet and left the key inside, Blau said. If this happens, the machine will fall down an endless series of mirrors. Such a flaws are often known as crocs, is so notorious as to have become uncommon, but Eagle's designers prepared for it just in case. Via the console control board, the CC, Eagle is intimately connected with a microcomputer, a standard data general micronova, which acts in part as Eagle's therapist. If Eagle goes haywire, the micronova should still function. Thus, it can run diagnostic programs to find out what's wrong with the larger machine, even if the larger machine is dead. The micronova also constantly paws through the bigger machine, on the lookout for such special deadly crocs as a page fault within a page fault. If it detects one, the CC board will be alerted, and it will send back a message to the micronova, which will send a warning to the system console, the big typewriter-like machine that sits next to Eagle's CPU, and the console will print out the following. Infinite page fault. CPU halted. If you're the operator of the system and you see this message, you put in a panicky call to Data General right away. But suppose none of that happened, said Blau. Suppose the next block of instructions needed for program FOOBAR is easily found. The SYS cache sends that block to the IP. The IP throws away another block of information to make room for this one, and now the search is over at last. Eagle can begin to execute the next instruction in program FOOBAR. The IP examines the encoded instruction and determines that it is a skip on equal, one of those instructions that tells the computer to compare two values and, depending on the result, to follow one of two paths. In assembly language, it's written as WSEQ, which could be the sound a rusty gate makes. Specifically, WSEQ instructs the machine to compare two values and if they are equal, to skip the next assembly language instruction in program FOOBAR and go on to the instruction after it. Assume, said Blau, that the two values, electrically encoded of course, have found their way into the arithmetic and logic unit, the ALU, sometimes known as the number cruncher, the heart of any computer. The IP has determined from the WSEQ instruction several items of information. The most important of these is the address of the microprogram that will tell Eagle exactly what to do in order to skip on equal. The microsequencer is asking for the address of the next microprogram. The IP now sends this address to the sequencer, and the sequencer starts running the microprogram. The IP has also derived at this time the location of the two values that are going to be compared. These packets are already in the ALU. The IP tells the ALU exactly where they are. Now we're moving down to a lower level of abstraction, Blau said. We're going down to where the microcoder lives. There's a clock inside Eagle. It ticks every 220 billionths of a second. Between each tick of the clock, Eagle performs one micro-instruction. Tick, said Blau. The sequencer sends out the first micro-instruction of the WSEQ microprogram. The micro-instruction is 75 bits, 75 units of high and low voltages. They scatter throughout the circuits. Some go to the ALU and tell it to subtract one of the two values from the other. Some of these microbits go to the IP, some to the ATU and IOC, and some go right back to the sequencer and tell it the address of the next micro-instruction in the WSEQ microprogram. Tick, the sequencer sends out that second micro-instruction. Part of it goes to the ALU, telling the ALU to examine the result of its subtraction. If the result of the subtraction is not zero, if, in other words, the two values are not equal, then the ALU sends a low voltage down a certain wire. The micro-instruction has told the microsequencer to monitor this wire. Finding a low voltage there, the sequencer brings the WSEQ microprogram to an end. It sends a message to the IP, saying, in effect, not equal, no skip on equal this time, get the next assembly language instruction in the user program. But if the result of the ALU's subtraction is zero, if the two values are equal, then the ALU sends a high voltage down the special wire that the microsequencer is monitoring. The sequencer interprets this and sends out the third and last micro-instruction in the WSEQ microprogram. Tick! Out goes this last line of microcode, telling all the boards to wait except for the IP. The IP is told to skip the next assembly language instruction in the user program and to resume operations with the next instruction after that. This, finally, is how Eagle skips over one crossroad in a program and starts down another road. West had said that designing a computer was a mind game. I asked Blau whether following an instruction around through the engine in the way that we had was the sort of mind game that they played when designing Eagle. You bet it is, he said, but they played hundreds of such mind games, and figuring out how to equip Eagle merely to WSEQ was itself much more intricate than Blau could fully explain in a single sitting. Such games of logic, especially if they are played in a hurry, while flying upside down, can take a grip on an engineer's thoughts and hold on. After playing this way for a while, you look at a tree, and aha, it is clear that a tree is much like a computer. And a road with side streets is, what else? A kind of computer program. Chuck Holland said that this unpleasant sensation of being locked inside the machine usually lingered 3 days, on the rare occasion when he got away from the basement for that long. West would sit at his desk and stare for hours at the team's drawings of the hardware, playing his own mind games with the results of the other engineers' mind games. Will this work? How much will this cost? Once, someone brought a crying baby past his door, and afterward it took him an hour to retrace his steps through the circuit design he had been pondering. Laughter outside often had the same effect, and once in a while it made his hands shake with rage, especially if he didn't like the design he'd been staring at. West usually drove out of Westboro fast after work. I can't talk about the machine, he said one evening, bent forward over the steering wheel. I've got to keep life and computers separate or else I'm gonna go mad.